What would you do if the only man in town who knew where a stolen fortune lay buried was the man everyone paid to bury the dead? In Dry Creek, in the tail end of a hard winter, a 44-year-old grave digger named Matthew Weaver took a $2 job filling in a stranger's plot and walked away carrying a suspicion no lawman had thought to carry. The gang who had emptied the bank in November had ridden out into a blizzard and vanished like smoke. But what he began to piece together beside a fresh mound of frozen earth would turn every whisper in that town on its head. Settle in. Keep the lantern close. This one is worth the sit. He came down off the ridge road at first light with the wagon creaking under him and the wind at his back like a hand that would not let him rest. Snow lay in thin bands across the wheel ruts. The sky was the color of tin. Dry Creek rose out of the flats the way it always had, a scatter of plank roofs and stovepipes leaning east. The little white church at the far end of the street with its cemetery running out behind it, toward the willows. Matthew Weaver sat the seat with his shoulders bowed under his wool coat, gloves stiff on the reins, his broad hat pulled low. He had been 3 days on the road hauling pine boards from the mill at the pass, and every mile of it had been the same slow ache in his chest. His wife had been gone 11 months now. The cabin at the edge of town still had her kettle on the stove and her shawl on the peg where she had left it, and he had not moved either. He was a carpenter by trade and a grave digger by need, and the need had been steady all winter. Fever had come through in December. He had buried 9 souls between the first snow and the thaw, and each shovelful of that hard ground had felt like a debt he could not name. People nodded to him on the street. They did not stop him to talk. A man who dug graves and lived alone drew a certain silence around him, and he had learned to wear it the way he wore his apron. He unhitched the team behind the livery and stood a moment with his forehead against the mare's warm neck. She blew softly at his glove. Down the street, in the churchyard, a small crowd had already gathered around a fresh hole in the ground. The dead man's name was Josiah Pike. Nobody in Dry Creek had known him before the week he arrived. He had come in during the last hard snow of the season on a lame horse, taken a room at the boarding house, and died coughing 3 nights later without saying much beyond his own name and a request for water. The doctor had shrugged. The undertaker had shrugged. The town had passed a hat, come up short, and the burial had fallen where most burdens in Dry Creek fell. To Matthew, who would take $2 and a bowl of stew and dig a stranger into the ground for the dignity of the thing. He walked over with his shovel across his shoulder. The pastor read short. The wind read shorter. When the last of the mourners drifted off toward the saloon, only Matthew and the boy who helped him sometimes were left to close the grave. That was when Ross Bidwell came out of the mercantile to watch, arms folded across his fine wool vest, a smile pulled tight across his teeth. Bidwell owned the freight office and half the notes in town, and he liked to stand where people could see him. "Weaver," he called, $2 for a nameless drifter. That's rich work." Matthew did not look up. "He'll rot the same as a rich man," Bidwell said. "You could plant him standing up for all the difference it makes." Matthew set the first shovel of dirt on the pine box. It landed with a hollow sound that traveled out across the stones. "Whole town laughing," Bidwell went on, louder now for the benefit of the men on the mercantile porch. "Weaver's inheritance, a dead stranger and a hole in the ground." Someone chuckled. The wind carried it. Matthew kept shoveling. He worked until the mound stood proud of the earth, tamped it flat with the back of the blade, and set the little wooden marker the pastor had scratched in pencil that morning. Josiah Pike. No dates, no kin. Just the name and a rough cross above it. By the time he was done, the street had emptied, and the light had gone the color of old brass. He was about to shoulder his shovel and go when he noticed the stone. It sat at the head of the grave where the wooden marker leaned, and it did not belong. It was creek stone, smooth, water-rounded, veined with quartz. The kind you found down by the willows a half-mile off, not up here in the churchyard soil. He crouched and turned it over in his glove. It was heavy for its size, wet on the underside, though the day had been dry. He set it back and stood a long moment looking at the mound. Then his boot caught on something in the loose earth. He bent and pulled, and a short length of hemp rope came up out of the dirt, no thicker than his thumb, cut clean at both ends. New rope. The kind a man would use to lower a heavy sack, not a coffin. The undertaker used canvas straps. Matthew himself used canvas straps. There was no reason on God's earth for a length of fresh rope to be buried in the fill above Josiah Pike. He rolled it once around his palm and slipped it into his coat pocket. The wind lifted the willows down along the creek and set them hissing. Somewhere a crow called twice and went quiet. Why would a grave digger pocket a scrap of rope from a stranger's fill? What did that smooth creek stone mean, laid where no creek stone belonged? And what had Josiah Pike carried into Dry Creek on that lame horse that no one had thought to ask about? If you're settling in for this one, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. And hit that subscribe so the next story finds you. Because what Matthew Weaver was about to remember, about a snowstorm 4 months gone, would change everything. He walked back down the street with the shovel over his shoulder and the rope heavy in his pocket, though it weighed almost nothing. The light had gone the color of tin. Lamps were coming up behind the boarding house windows. From the open door of the saloon, he could hear a piano missing 2 keys and the low tide of men who had already forgotten which grave they had stood beside that afternoon. He kept to the far side of the road. He did not want company. He got it anyway. 2 young hands from the freight office stood on the mercantile porch, chewing tobacco and watching him come. One of them nudged the other. The nudge carried down the street clear as a spoken word. "Aye, there he goes," the taller one said. $2 man." "Buries them cheap," said the other. "Buries them quick." Matthew did not look up. He had learned a long time ago that a man's silence was the one coin no one could take from him. He shifted the shovel to his other shoulder and kept walking. Behind him, a woman on the boarding house steps murmured something to another woman, and the second woman laughed a small, dry laugh and let the laugh fall away. The word drifter came out of it, and the word pauper, and the word fool. He heard all 3, and none of them landed anywhere he had not already been struck. Ross Bidwell stepped out of the freight office as if he had been waiting for the sound of Matthew's boots. He had traded his wool vest for a longer coat, but kept the same face. He leaned on the porch rail and lit a small cigar and watched Matthew pass the way a man watches a stray dog cross his yard. "Weaver," he called, "you planning to charge the town for that shovel too?" Matthew did not stop. "Only asking," Bidwell said, louder now for the porch. "Man does 11 graves for $2 apiece. Folks start to wonder what he thinks he's owed." One of the freight hands laughed. Another spat. "Nothing," Matthew said, not turning. "I don't think I'm owed nothing." "Good," Bidwell said. "See that you don't." Matthew walked on. The rope in his pocket knocked lightly against his hip with every step, and he found he was thinking of the sound a heavy sack makes when it settles into a hole. At the corner where the road bent toward his cabin, An old woman was sitting on an overturned crate outside the mission house with a blanket across her knees. Her name was Hetty Marsh, and she had been in Dry Creek longer than the church. She was blind in one eye and half in the other, and she still knew every foot that passed her by the weight it laid on the plank walk. "I'm Matthew Weaver," she said, before he had spoken. He stopped. He touched the brim of his hat. "Evening, Miss Hetty." She turned her good eye up at him. The light from the mission window caught the milk in the other one. "You dug a stranger today." "I did." She was quiet a while. The wind moved the ends of her blanket. Somewhere down the street, the piano gave up on its tune and started another one just as broken. "Some men," she said, "are buried with what they carried. Some men are buried on top of it." He waited for more. There was no more. She turned her face back toward the dark end of the street as though she had said nothing at all, and her hands went on folding a corner of the blanket over a corner of the blanket, the way old hands do when the mind has gone on ahead. "Ma'am," Matthew said softly, "I don't take your meaning." "You will," she said, "or you won't. Go home, Matthew Weaver. It's cold." He stood a moment longer. Then he touched his hat again and went on. At the cabin, he stabled the team and forked hay and watered them by lantern light, and did not go inside for a long while. When he did, he set the shovel by the door and hung his coat on the peg beside his wife's shawl, and took the rope out and laid it on the table next to the tin of coffee. He looked at it. He looked at the kettle that had not moved in 11 months. He looked at the shawl. "Some men are buried on top of it," he said aloud to the empty room. The room did not answer. Outside, the wind lifted along the eaves and let itself down again. And out past the willows, the creek ran under its skin of ice, and somewhere above the churchyard, a crow was making its bed in the pine. He did not sleep well that night. Twice he sat up in the dark, with the sense that he had left a tool out in the rain. The third time he did not lie back down. Before first light he was dressed. He put the rope back in his coat pocket. He lit the lantern and shuttered it low, and stepped out into a morning the color of wet slate. The town was still asleep. Only one stovepipe in the whole street was drawing smoke, and that was the baker's. He walked the long way around, past the smithy and behind the livery, so that no one on the mercantile porch would see him take the path to the church. The churchyard lay behind the little white building in a fenced square that sloped down toward the willows and the creek. 9 of the mounds he had made himself that winter. He knew every one of them by the set of the earth. Ellen Barrow under the elm. The Ridley twins side by side. Old Wyatt Hood by the north fence where he had asked to lie so he could hear the water. And now Josiah Pike, fresh and proud, at the edge nearest the willows, with the wooden marker leaning where Matthew had left it, and the creek stone still at its head. He knelt. The frost had come in the night and laid a thin white crust over everything. But around the base of the marker, the crust was broken. Not by boots, by something dragged. A shallow scuff ran from the mound down toward the fence, and stopped where the fence met the willow line. He followed it with his eyes. It might have been a fox. It might have been a coyote come in for the smell of new-turned earth. It might have been a man in soft moccasins, careful of his tracks. He set the lantern down on the mound and let the shutter open a finger's width. The light fell across the creek stone and set the quartz vein burning like a wet nerve. He looked at that vein a long time. Then he sat back on his heels and settled in to wait for the sun. It came slow. The sky went from slate to pearl to the pale, bruised pink of a winter dawn, and the frost on the mounds began to bead and slide, and the willows down by the creek stood up one by one out of the dark and became themselves. A magpie landed on the church roof and looked at him and went away. Somewhere in the town a door slammed. A rooster spoke, was answered, spoke again. Matthew did not move. He listened. He listened for the thing under the sound of the wind, the way a carpenter listens to a beam by rapping it once with the flat of his hand. The mound at Josiah Pike's grave did not ring true. He could not have said how he knew it. He only knew that when the wind came off the creek and lifted along the fence, it hollowed at the fresh earth in a way it did not hollow at the older mounds, as though what lay beneath were not spent flesh and pine boards, but something denser and stranger, something the ground had not yet learned to hold. He stayed there until his knees ached and the sun cleared the roof of the smithy. He ate a piece of bread from his pocket. He drank cold coffee from a tin cup he had brought. He watched the scuff mark from the mound to the fence lengthen and shorten as the light changed, and he understood that whoever had made it had been standing at the head of the grave and had walked slow and heavy toward the willows, carrying nothing, or had walked light back the other way, carrying much. By mid-morning, he had told himself 3 times he was a fool. Twice he had almost stood up and gone home. A drifter died. A rope got dropped. A stone got kicked out of the creek by a boy throwing rocks at a magpie. That was all. That was all any of it ever was. But the 3rd time he told himself so, his eye caught something new. Down at the base of the fence, where the scuff ended, a single willow whip had been broken clean off at knee height and laid across 2 others, so lightly you would not see it unless you were already looking. It was the mark a man leaves for himself so he can find a place again in the dark. Matthew Weaver looked at that broken whip a long time. Then he closed the lantern shutter and took up his tin cup and walked home through the frost, and did not once look back at the churchyard, because he did not want anyone watching from the porches to see him look. At the cabin, he set the tin cup on the table beside the rope and stood for a long moment looking at both. The kettle on the stove had not moved. The shawl on the peg had not moved. He himself, he thought, had not moved in 11 months. Not truly, though his hands had lifted a shovel every day, and his back had learned the shape of 9 mounds. Something about the willow whip laid across the other 2 had entered him, where nothing had entered in a long time. He took off his coat and hung it beside the shawl, and stood by the stove until the cold left his fingers. And then he pulled the rope out of the pocket again, and laid it beside the first length on the table. 2 ropes now. He had not remembered pocketing a second, but there it was, shorter, the same clean-cut ends, the same new hemp still smelling faintly of the mill. He must have pulled it from the fill without knowing. His hands had known before his mind had. He stared at the 2 lengths lying parallel on the pine boards and thought of how a man ties a sack. 2 hitches, top and bottom, so the weight rides even between 2 carriers. 2 ropes cut clean. He sat down slow. The smell of new hemp opened something in him. It was the smell of the mill at the pass. And the smell of the mill at the pass was the smell of December. And December brought the memory back whole, the way memory sometimes will when a man has been fighting it. 4 months earlier. The last hard snow of the season, the one that came sideways and did not stop for a day and a night. He had been at the window of the cabin with a mug in his hand, watching the road, because his wife had been 3 weeks buried, and he could not sleep, and he had taken to standing at the window in the small hours, as though somebody might yet come up the road who could undo it. Nobody had come up the road who could undo it, but 4 riders had come up the road. He had watched them because there was nothing else moving in the world. 4 men on tired horses, hats pulled low, coats crusted white, and between the 2nd and 3rd rider, a 5th horse with no rider on its back, and a shape lashed across the saddle under canvas. He had thought at the time it was a body. He had thought a party had lost one of their own to the storm and was carrying him to the church. He had almost pulled on his boots and gone out to help, but the wind had taken the shape of a voice and told him plainly to stay where he was. And the riders had gone on past his cabin toward the churchyard and the willows, and the snow had swallowed them. And by morning he had convinced himself he had dreamed it. He had not dreamed it. He put a hand flat on the table between the two ropes and held it there until it stopped shaking. Then he got up and stirred the stove and set the kettle to boil for the first time in 11 months, because a man cannot think without something warm to drink, and he had thinking to do. He did not yet know what to do with what he knew. He knew only that the shape under the canvas that night had not been a body. A body does not ride so square across a saddle. A body sags. What had ridden between the second and third rider had ridden the way a strongbox rides, or two. He did not act. He drank the coffee. He watched the window. He listened for hooves on the road that did not come. When full dark had settled, he blew out the lamp and lay down in his clothes and stared at the ceiling beams until the roosters called, and he did not sleep, and he did not act. The next morning he acted. Not on the grave. Not yet. He went instead to the woodshed and took down the tools a man takes down when he means to look busy in plain sight. A hammer, a short cross-cut saw, a leather roll of chisels his father had left him, the handles worn to the shape of a weaver hand across 2 generations. He set them in the wagon bed and hitched the older of his 2 mares, the sorrel his wife had called Junie, whose muzzle had gone gray around the edges and whose left eye had milked over the winter Ellen Barrow died. Junie stood while he buckled the traces and blew a slow breath against his shoulder, the way she had done every morning of the last 9 years. He rested his forehead against her neck for the space of 3 of those breaths. Then he climbed up and clucked her forward and went down the street in full sight of the mercantile porch and the freight office porch and the boarding house steps, because a man who wishes to hide a thing must first be seen doing something else. He drove to the church. He tied Junie to the rail by the vestry door where she could crop the dead grass. He went inside and found the pastor at his desk and said the fence at the back of the churchyard had rotted through in 3 places and would take a bad wind before Easter. The pastor said he had noticed. Matthew said he would mend it for the cost of the lumber. The pastor said the church could not pay the lumber. Matthew said he had lumber left from the mill run. The pastor took off his spectacles and looked at him a long moment and said, "God bless you, Matthew Weaver." And Matthew said nothing to that and went out. He began at the north fence near old Wyatt Hood, because a man does not begin his true work at the place his true work lies. He set the sawhorses. He measured. He pulled the rotted rails one by one and laid them aside for kindling. Junie watched him from the vestry rail with her one good eye, and every so often she shifted a hoof and blew, and every time she blew he looked up and took the measure of the churchyard as though checking his line, and every time he looked up his eye went to the willow line at the far corner and came back. By noon he had replaced 4 rails on the north side. The sound of the hammer carried across the town, and that was what he wanted. A hammer is an honest sound. A hammer says a man is where he says he is, doing what he says he is doing, and nothing else. Under the honest sound, his mind was working at a different frame entirely. He was counting paces from the vestry door to the willow line as he crossed to fetch a rail. He was counting paces from Josiah Pike's mound to the broken whip as he crossed back. He was measuring the slope of the ground and asking himself where a man carrying weight at night would set his feet. and where he would stop to rest, and where he would kneel. By mid-afternoon, he had shifted to the east fence, closer to the willows. Ross Bidwell rode by on the road once, slowed his horse, watched from the saddle for a long minute, then rode on without a word. Matthew did not look up. He drove a nail and drove another and drove a third and let the freight man go. Junie flicked one ear back toward the road and forward again when the hoofbeats faded, and Matthew murmured her name once, low, and she blew. He worked until the light went the color of old brass. He gathered his tools. He walked the length of the new fence with his hand trailing on the top rail and stopped, as if by accident, at the corner nearest the willows, where the scuff mark had run that morning and the broken whip lay across its two fellows. In the day's last light, he saw what he had not seen at dawn. The ground between the fence and the first willow was disturbed in a long, shallow oval, not dug, only tamped. The way a man tamps a place, he has set something down and then covered with leaf and needle to hide the shape. And at the far end of the oval, no bigger than a coin, a fleck of raw pine showed through the litter where a knot had been kicked loose from a plank buried an inch under the soil. Matthew Weaver stood over that fleck of pine and did not kneel. He did not brush the needles aside. He did not even let his eyes rest on it long enough for a watcher to note. He turned his back to the willows and walked to the wagon and unhitched Junie and led her home by the bridle because his hands were not steady enough to drive. And all the way down the street, past the porches and the lamplit windows and the piano missing 2 keys, he kept his face plain and his shoulders easy. And only Junie, walking at his elbow with her gray muzzle brushing his glove, knew that the man beside her had found the lid of the thing. At the cabin, he stabled Junie in the dark. He forked hay by feel. He did not light the lantern until the barn door was closed behind him. Inside the house, he did not light one at all. He sat at the table in his coat, with the 2 ropes lying between his hands, and waited for the town to go to sleep. The saloon quieted first, then the boarding house, then the last of the porches. A dog barked once behind the smithy and gave up. Matthew listened to the creek moving under its ice and to the wind pulling at the pine above the churchyard. He thought of the fleck of raw pine no bigger than a coin. He thought of 4 riders in the snow and a shape lashed square across a saddle. He thought of Hetty Marsh saying some men are buried on top of it. A little after midnight he stood, took a short spade from the wall, wrapped it in sacking so it would not ring, and put a pry bar under his coat. He shuttered the lantern to a thread. He did not take Junie. He went out on foot through the pasture behind the cabin, cut down along the creek where the willows would hide him from the porches, and came up on the churchyard from the waterside. The frost had come again. The willows were black against a sky the color of bruised pewter. Matthew knelt at the shallow oval and brushed the needles away with the flat of his glove. Working slow, working small, sweeping the litter into a mound at his knee so he could put it back. Under the needles he found leaf mold. Under the leaf mold he found soil that had been turned. Under the turned soil, an inch down, he found the plank. It was pine, rough sawn, the width of a coffin lid, but only half the length. He worked the pry bar into the seam his fingers had found, and lifted the plank away in one piece and set it on the mound of needles. He opened the lantern's shutter another thread. The light fell into the hole in pieces. First a corner of canvas, oiled and dark. Then the corner of a strap. Then a brass buckle green with weather. Matthew's breath left him in a slow line of white. He lifted the canvas. Beneath the canvas sat a strong box. It was iron-banded oak, no bigger than a bread crock, but heavy in the way only one thing on earth is heavy for its size. Behind it, Wedged sideways to save room sat a second. A length of new hemp rope was still knotted around the near handle, cut clean where a man had freed one hitch and left the other for the next carry. Matthew touched the wood of the nearer box with the tip of his glove, as a man touches the flank of a horse he is not sure of. He did not open them there. He knew what they held, the way a carpenter knows a beam is sound before he strikes it. He had heard the story 2 counties over of the stage that vanished with the payroll for the mining company, and of the 4 men who had ridden off into weather nobody would follow them into. He had heard it and forgotten it. The town had heard it and forgotten it. Everyone had. He fitted the plank back. He raked the leaf mold over the plank. He swept the needles back across the leaf mold with the flat of his glove until the shallow oval looked again as it had at dusk. He set a small pebble at the corner nearest the fence as a mark of his own. He shuttered the lantern. He sat back on his heels in the dark and let his hands shake because there was no one to see them. He walked home along the creek the way he had come. He did not sleep. Toward the small hours, he stood at the window with his wife's shawl held against his chest and watched the road, and the road stayed empty, and the wind pulled at the pine above the churchyard, and the kettle he had put to boil the day before had gone cold on the stove, and he set it to boil again. 2 days he did nothing. He mended the east fence. He set the last rails on the south. He ate at the boarding house once so the town would see him eat. He spoke to no one of what lay under the needles by the willows. Not to the pastor, not to Hetty Marsh, not to Junie in her stall, though he stood a long time at her shoulder on the second night, with his forehead against her neck and his hand on her withers, and she blew her slow breath against his coat as if she already knew. On the 3rd night the weather turned. The wind came down off the pass in the late afternoon, carrying a smell of iron and old snow, and by dark it was throwing sleet sideways against the shutters. The stovepipes on Dry Creek leaned harder east. The pine above the churchyard bent and did not straighten. Matthew banked the stove, set the kettle back, and was pulling off his boots when a fist struck the cabin door. He opened it on a woman with a child in her arms, and a man behind her half fallen against the jamb. Their coats were sheathed in ice. The woman's lips were the color of a bruise. The man's right sleeve was black to the elbow, with blood not yet frozen. Behind them in the road, 2 horses stood with their heads down and their reins trailing. "Please," the woman said. Matthew took the child from her before he took her name. He carried the child to the stove and set her on the rag rug and stripped the wet coat off her and wrapped her in his wife's shawl before he thought what he was doing. He went back for the man and got a shoulder under his good arm and brought him to the bench by the fire. The woman came in on her own feet and shut the door against the wind and stood there swaying. "Riders," the man said. His voice was thin. "On the road. 3. He fought for the next breath. "Took my brother at the fork. Took the payroll wagon a month back, and now they are back for—" He stopped and looked at Matthew and then at the shawl around the child. "For what is buried," Matthew said. The man's eyes closed. "You know." "I know." The woman began to cry without sound. Matthew put the kettle on the hotter side of the stove and cut the man's sleeve away with his knife and saw the wound was through the meat and not the bone. He looked once at the door, once at the shawl around the child, and once at the shuttered window facing the road toward the church. He had walked past the willows that afternoon and had felt watched. He had told himself he was tired. He had been wrong. He set water to heat. He took down the pry bar from where he had leaned it behind the door and set it against the wall by his hand. He looked at the woman and said, "You are safe here." He looked at the man and said, Sleep if you can." He looked at the child in the shawl and could not speak for a moment. Then Matthew Weaver put on his coat again and took the lantern and the spade wrapped in sacking and went out into the sleet toward the churchyard, because the thing under the needles was no longer a secret he could afford to leave in the ground, and the 3 riders on the road would come for it before dawn. The sleet stung his face, and the ice in the ruts cracked under his boots. Matthew Weaver did not go the roadway. He went behind the pasture, along the creek, into the churchyard from the waterside as he had before, keeping the willows between himself and any watcher on the road. The lantern he did not open. He worked by the shape of the ground and the memory of paces counted in daylight. At the shallow oval, he brushed away the needles with his glove, pried up the plank, and cut the oiled canvas free. The strong boxes were heavier than a man alone should lift, and he did not lift them. He rolled them one at a time onto the canvas, hitched the 2 ropes he had carried in his pocket for 2 days to the corners, and dragged the load across the frozen grass toward the vestry door. The runners of the canvas hissed on the ice. Junie was not with him, and he was glad of that. She would have flicked her ear back at every gust and given him away. The pastor opened the vestry door in his nightshirt with a candle in his hand and did not speak. Matthew said only, "Help me." Together they hauled the load inside and set it behind the altar under the choir bench and covered it with the canvas that had covered the coffin cart. The pastor looked at the boxes and then at Matthew and then at the boxes again. "Josiah Pike," he said. "Josiah Pike," Matthew said. "There is a family at my cabin. A man with a bullet through his arm, a child, 3 riders on the road." The pastor set the candle down and reached for the bell rope. The bell of Dry Creek had not rung before dawn since the last fever. It rang now, slow and heavy, 3 strokes and 3 and 3. Lamps woke in the boarding house. Doors slammed. Men came into the street in coats over long shirts with rifles in their hands. Ross Bidwell came out of the freight office in his long coat with a rifle across his arm and did not speak. The pastor stood on the church step and told them plainly and briefly what was buried and what was coming. He did not name Matthew. Matthew stood at the corner of the vestry in the sleet and let the pastor speak. The 3 riders came up the road at the gray edge of first light. They saw the town in the street, and the rifles and the bell still moving in the tower, and they wheeled their horses. 2 of them made the fork before the men of Dry Creek reached them. The 3rd had a lame horse, and gave himself up on his knees in the mud beside the mercantile porch, without a shot fired. He was a young man with a cracked lip and a coat crusted white, and he looked, Matthew thought, no older than the freight office hand, who had called him a $2 man. He would not meet Matthew's eye. By full light word had gone out on the fastest horse Dry Creek had, and by the 2nd morning, a company agent rode in from 2 counties over with a deputy marshal at his side. The agent was a small, tidy man in a black coat and clean spectacles, who spoke softly and read a ledger through to the last line before he said anything at all. He knelt by the strong boxes in the vestry and turned the brass buckle up to the light and matched a number stamped on the iron band to a number in his book. He closed the book. "This is the Copperline payroll," he said. "Every dollar. You have my company's thanks, Mr. Weaver, and my own." He offered his hand, and Matthew took it. The agent's grip was dry and firm and a little longer than a stranger's would be. Outside the vestry, the town stood in a loose half-circle. The 2 freight office hands were at the back of the crowd and had taken off their hats. The 2 women from the boarding house steps were among the women who had brought bread and a pot of stew to the church door for the family in Matthew's cabin. Ross Bidwell stood at the freight office rail with his rifle set aside and his hands in his coat pockets, and looked at the church a long time before he came across the road. He stopped in front of Matthew and did not offer his hand and did not need to. "Weaver," he said. "Bidwell. That fence looks well set. It will hold." Bidwell nodded once, looked at the vestry door and then at his own boots, and said, "I was wrong about the man." He did not say which man he meant, and it did not matter. He turned and walked back to the freight office and went inside and did not come out again that day. Nobody laughed at him for it, and nobody laughed at Matthew again either. The company agent posted a reward that Matthew would not touch until the pastor took him aside and said the church roof was rotten in 4 places and the mission house had no stove that would hold coal through a winter, and then Matthew signed the paper and told the agent where to send the money. Hetty Marsh, when the boy read her the news at her crate outside the mission house, tilted her half-blind face up toward the sky and said, "I told him he would understand." The boy said, "Ma'am?" And she said, "Never mind, child. Go and eat." The family in the cabin stayed a week, the man's wound closed clean. The child took to Junie and rode her once around the pasture at a walk with Matthew's hand on the bridle. On the 5th day, a rider came in from the fork with word that the man's brother had been found alive in a line shack with a broken ankle and a great deal to say. And the woman put her face in Matthew's wife's shawl and wept until she could breathe again. When they left, she folded the shawl carefully and laid it back on the peg beside Matthew's coat and did not try to thank him with words, because there were none that fit. Spring came slowly to Dry Creek that year, the way it always did. The creek broke its ice in long slabs that rode down toward the willows and past them and out of sight. The willows themselves put out a pale green haze that thickened day by day into leaf. The 9 mounds Matthew had made through the winter began to settle and green over, and the 10th, at the edge nearest the water, settled with them. He carved a proper marker for Josiah Pike out of a length of oak from his father's shed and set it where the pencil-scratched board had leaned, and beneath the name he cut, in letters no deeper than a fingernail, the single word, "Rested." On an evening in the first true warmth of the year, Matthew Weaver walked out to the churchyard with Junie beside him and no shovel in his hand. The sun was going down behind the smithy, and the light had turned the color of old brass, as it had on the day he first turned the creek stone over in his glove. The new fence stood square along all 4 sides. The willows moved with a sound like slow water. The pine above the churchyard held a single crow that did not call. He stopped at Josiah Pike's marker and laid his palm flat against the top of it. Junie blew a long breath against his shoulder and stood. He thought of a shape lashed square across a saddle in a snowstorm 4 months earlier, of Hetty Marsh saying some men are buried on top of what they carried, of 2 ropes laid parallel on a pine table, of a fleck of raw pine no bigger than a coin. He thought of his wife's kettle on the stove and of the shawl folded back on its peg. He thought of the child riding Junie at a walk. The pastor came out through the vestry door with a lantern he did not need yet and stood at a respectful distance and did not speak. After a while he said quietly, "You built something here, Matthew." Matthew Weaver looked at the mounds and at the fence and at the willows going gold in the last of the light. He rested his hand on Junie's neck. "I only kept faith with what was already in the ground," he said. The pastor nodded and did not answer. Junie shifted a hoof. The crow lifted from the pine and flew low across the creek and was gone. The light on the willows deepened from brass to copper, to the soft red of a banked fire, and then the fire went down, and the churchyard held its quiet. Thank you for staying to the end of this one, and for walking the winter road of Dry Creek all the way to its spring. If the story of a quiet man keeping faith with the dead moved you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe so the next tale finds you when the lantern goes up. Ride easy until then. There is another story waiting on the trail.